The instruction starts in 10 seconds, but I show 2 quilt samples at the beginning that you can't really see, so here they are. This quilting has been spaced to fit the quilt using math, and you'll see there's some distracting spaces in between the rows. And this quilt uses my no math, no measuring method that I'm about to demonstrate. Enjoy! Hi, I'm Kathie James, professional long-arm quilter and pattern designer. I'd like to share with you my preferred method for quilting pantograph patterns to make it easier, faster, and more beautiful for your quilts. My method is super easy. No math, no measuring, no special spacing, no grid. It produces a quilt that is quilted beautifully and evenly from edge to edge every time. I've quilted nearly 1,500 quilts this way over 10 years. I've won national quilting awards in the edge-to-edge category, and I have hundreds of customers who love the results of this method. When I started long-arm quilting, I noticed that when a design has been spaced using math to fit the quilt top exactly, my eye is distracted by the extra spaces at the top, the bottom, and especially between the rows, like on this sample with my feather pattern. Here's the same sample with my no math, no spacing method. I like to think the unique interlock I design into each of my patterns makes the first quilt look good, but even with the extra spacing. But I think you'll agree this quilt looks pretty fabulous. I'm confident you'll appreciate the beautiful results of my simple method with all of your patterns. Here's what I do. I edge the design against the quilt top as opposed to centering the design. Then I quilt a partial first row. Each row after that is exactly spaced the way it's drawn on the paper for the perfect interlock, and the last row naturally becomes a partial row. Let me show you how I edge the design using my Baptist fan pattern. I use my vertical channel locks to find the edge of the quilt top, and then I move these clear colored strips to show on the pattern where the quilt top edge is. I cut these clear strips from a folder from the office supply store, and then I just put blue painter's tape on the edges to make them stick and easily removable from the table. Now I stand back and I look at both edges of my pattern to see where the pattern falls on the quilt top. You can see here I've got a real small piece of a fan on the left side and a really big part of a fan on the right side. So now I'm going to pull my pattern right or left until I've got a really nice fan on both edges. This is what I mean by edging the pattern against the top instead of centering the pattern. It gives the most polished look every time. Now I'm going to switch to my chocolate swirl feather pattern and we're going to quilt. I'll show you my no math spacing that gives a beautiful look to every quilt. So I've edged this chocolate swirl feather pattern against my colored strips and I'm ready to quilt. Here's a great tip my Gammill dealer showed me. You put a piece of painter tape over your laser light and poke a small hole in it with a pin. This makes a smaller dot onto your paper and gives you much better accuracy following the pattern. And here's a really good tip from me. When you're following the pattern, I find it's much more important to be smooth than to follow the line exactly. So it's a little off the line, that's okay. I always start by quilting a partial row. This way there's no empty space at the top of the quilt. I design all of my patterns for the horizontal line to match up with the top of the quilt or the bottom of the quilt, either way. That makes the first partial row super easy. I anchor my thread just outside the edge of the top by stitching back and forth a little, then I start quilting. Let me show you. quilted all the rows in the quilt using the exact spacing on the paper pattern every time? Here's another tip that saves a lot of time. When a design has more than one row, I quilt from the left on the first row, then I take basting stitches up the side of the pattern to the next row, and then I quilt the next row left to right. I don't have to stop, move the machine, anchor my threads. It also helps to keep the batting more even inside the quilt instead of smooshing it all to one side. Now I'm going to show you how to advance with the perfect spacing. I'm going to drop my needle on one spot of the pattern and then advance the quilt into that exact same spot. So I'll choose this large swirl. So I'm going to drop my needle and I'll advance it to the same swirl on the pattern. Okay, I'm on the last row of the quilt and it ends somewhere in the middle of a row. That's what's perfect about this no measuring, no math method. It's supposed to end on a partial row. Every now and then it ends on a perfect row and that looks really good too, so no worries. But I have a great tip to quilt this last row super fast and easy. I set the horizontal lock 1/4 inch away from the edge of the top of the quilt because I'm just going to quilt the partial row. And then I mark it using a China wax marker. Let me show you. This marker cleans off super easy with a piece of scrap cotton batting that has just a drop of clear sewing oil on it. Makes it really easy to quilt that partial row. So now I'm going to anchor my thread and quilt the end of the quilt. Here's the finished quilt. You can see it's perfectly covering the top without any extra distracting spaces. Another example would be my embroidery sampler quilt. This has feather on it using the no spacing. I find on sampler quilts that this method is particularly useful, and you can see I quilt right through the embroideries. If you're interested in any of my embroidery patterns, you can just search Kathie James embroidery in Google. But let me show you one special pattern. This quilt has my interlocking stipple pantograph. I quilt through appliques as well, but it gives the all-over perfect look, and this is one of my best tips. Just in case you've never heard this best tip ever about why you would stipple using a pattern instead of freehanding, when you freehand from the front of the machine, there's always at least one fabric where the color blends in so well it disappears and you can't see where you're going. Sometimes it's hard to see the entire quilt, and no matter how good you are, sometimes you stipple yourself into a corner or bump into your bar and you have to start over, rip out, start again. I wasted so much time once on a simple stipple quilt that I stopped and designed my interlocking stipple pattern. I drew the pattern freehand, so it looks freehand quilted, and I designed a nearly invisible interlock. This quilts 13 inches of stipple in one row, so you don't have to advance the quilt very many times, and it looks like perfect freehand stipple every time. This pattern also comes in a 9-inch size, but I give permission on the copyright of all my patterns for you to resize them to any size you need in your studio. So whether you have a smaller machine or you just want the pattern smaller for specific quilts, you can resize any of my patterns. I designed all of my patterns to either look like freehand quilting or to fill a specific need for my customer quilts through the years. For example, Feather Feather lets me quilt a beautiful feather that's fast and deep, so I can offer a feather at a lower price. I save time, my customers save money. You might be shocked to know how many hundreds of quilts I've put that design on. Other designs that look freehand quilted include my Fern Meander, Freehand Flourish, and Deco Hollyhock, among others. Some of my other patterns make traditional designs easier with a pantograph, like my traditional Baptist fan, improved clamshell, and offset crosshatch. You can see all 24 of my patterns at ColumbiaRiverQuilting.com. Search by designer and look under Kathie James. On that website, I've described each pattern by skill. For beginner, intermediate, or advanced, I suggest what style of quilt it would look good on, and I note how many inches of working depth you need. I don't like to advance a quilt so many times, so a lot of my patterns are pretty deep, but remember you can resize them to any size that works for you. Because you've stayed until the very end of this video, I'll tell you my best tip ever. When you get a new pattern, instead of wasting fabric to practice until you're comfortable, simply clip your thread so it doesn't tangle, just past your tensioner here. Remove the needle from the machine and stitch the design with the machine turned on until you've mastered it. That gives you plenty of practice or even warm up in the morning before you get going with your thread fully engaged. I hope you found this demonstration of my pantograph method helpful. Thank you for considering this simpler approach to beautiful quilts every time.